Hey guys, tonight we're going to time travel somewhere very dry, very dusty, and frankly, very fed up. You're trudging through the ancient city of Ur, a sun-baked Sumerian metropolis where the streets are lined with baked mud brick houses, the air smells like goat, and someone's always muttering about being overcharged for copper. The year is somewhere around 1750 BCE. You're in sandals, you're a little sweaty, and you've just brushed against a prickly basket full of barley that some merchant left in the road. There's shouting in the distance. Not war, not celebration, just someone loudly and formally expressing deep dissatisfaction with a recent purchase. And no, they're not sending an email. They're writing it down on clay with a stick. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle toward the commotion near a small stall tucked between a ziggurat and the local reed market. The air here is heavy with the mingled smell of river mud, camel hair, and roasted onions, an oddly comforting combination. A man in a linen tunic is furiously scratching something into a wet clay tablet, muttering under his breath about substandard ingots and disgraceful business conduct. You've stumbled upon history's earliest known customer service complaint. Welcome to the origin story of every bad Yelp review, every angry email to a manager, and every passive-aggressive post-it note left on an office fridge. This is where it all begins. As you walk through Ur, you begin to notice just how complex everything is. This isn't some primitive society. It's a fully functioning city-state, complete with law codes, taxation, trade routes, and more bureaucracy than a late-stage startup. People are buying and selling copper, barley, textiles, and even livestock. And with all that trade, naturally, come misunderstandings and grievances. And you pass a man bargaining for dates under an awning made of palm leaves. He seems nervous. The seller is smiling a little too broadly, and you just know those dates are half fermented. But here's the thing. If that buyer ends up unhappy, he can't just walk away. Not here. In ancient Mesopotamia, your word is your contract, and your reputation? Practically sacred. So, what do you do when someone messes with your livelihood? When the copper you ordered arrives chipped, cracked, and covered in weird green crust? You do what Nani did. Nani was a merchant from Ur, and sometime around 1750 BCE, he commissioned a delivery of copper ingots from another merchant named Ea Nasser. But when the goods arrived, after a journey of several hundred kilometers, Nani was less than thrilled. He didn't just grumble. He composed a letter of complaint so exquisite, so formal, and so delightfully salty that it survived for nearly 4,000 years. Seriously, it's sitting in the British Museum right now. And the best part? We don't have Ea Nasir's response. If he ever wrote one, it's long gone, perhaps smashed in a rage or buried under centuries of indifference. But Nani's tablet? Oh, it endures. As you walk down the main road, a scribe passes you, carrying a satchel full of damp clay tablets wrapped in palm leaves. He's probably on his way to a temple archive, where some poor junior priest has to catalog these complaints for divine posterity. The system is so deeply entrenched that people have jobs just to manage other people's complaints. Sound familiar? The temple looms ahead now, casting a long, cool shadow over the street. You step into its shade gratefully. Inside, scribes hunch over wooden desks, their styluses clacking quietly as they imprint rows of tiny wedges into slabs of clay. The tablets sit in neat rows, drying slowly, Some are letters, some are contracts. One, curiously, appears to be a recipe for stewed locusts, but just a few, are full-on rants. These are the ancestors of every customer service tirade you've ever heard. Now, historians still argue whether this system was mostly symbolic or actually resulted in real compensation. Did the temples intervene? Did anyone care? Or were these just ceremonial complaints, offered to the gods more than the vendors? What's clear is that people kept writing them, over and over. Back outside, a donkey brays angrily, perhaps also unhappy with its copper purchase. Or maybe just the heat. You glance toward the river. Someone's washing clay off their hands. You imagine how many arguments, how many disappointments, and how many small human dramas have played out here, all tied to that most ancient of grievances. This is not what I ordered. And really, haven't we all been there? You're still in Ur, and the day isn't getting any cooler. As you wipe a trickle of sweat from your brow, you start to notice something odd. People aren't shouting as much anymore. Instead, they're whispering to scribes, handing over clay slabs like secret notes. You ease closer, curious, and that's when you catch it. Tiny symbols, neat little wedge-shaped marks, lined up in rows like an organized army of breadcrumbs. You've found yourself at the heart of ancient communication. Not gossip, not song, not interpretive dance, but writing. Specifically, cuneiform, the earliest known writing system used for everything from tax ledgers to, yes, complaints about substandard goods. It doesn't look like much. A scribe dips his reed stylus into wet clay and starts tapping away, quickly and rhythmically. The result? A bunch of lines and triangles that could pass for very determined chicken scratches. But this is no idle doodling. This is bureaucracy in action. And right now, a lot of it sounds personal. Merchant of Lagash claims the sheep were bald, one scribe mutters while scratching out another line. Client of Ian Asir refuses to pay unless given proper copper, not crumbs. These aren't just dusty business records, they're ancient receipts laced with sarcasm. Cuneiform, in its essence, was a visual language made of wedge-shaped impressions. You press a stylus, usually a sharpened reed, into soft clay, let it dry in the sun, and voila! Instant document. Delete key? Not so much. If you mess up, you either scratch it out clumsily or smash the whole thing and start over. Frustrating? Certainly. Therapeutic? Possibly. It's worth noting that writing wasn't widespread. Most people were illiterate, relying instead on trained scribes to handle their written affairs. That made scribes the unsung power players of Mesopotamian society, basically a cross between a court reporter, a personal assistant, and that one cousin who always helps you write difficult emails. Some scribes were honest. Others, well, let's just say they had creative interpretation skills, especially when paid in extra figs. Now, while most cuneiform tablets dealt with agricultural inventories or lunar cycles, there were outliers. The grumpy gems of the archive. Complaint tablets, often dictated in frustration, read like ancient versions of angry tweets, short, specific, and heavy on passive-aggressive undertones. One famous example? A customer accusing a fish seller of knowingly providing foul-smelling catch. Not exactly a poetic epic, but very relatable. And here's the kicker. Historians still argue whether these tablets were practical complaints or ceremonial gestures. Were people genuinely expecting refunds, or were they just venting, knowing full well nothing would change? Some experts believe these messages doubled as public shaming tools, kind of like taping a note to a village wall saying, Don't buy from this guy. He's a fraud and also smells like onions. And you can imagine the satisfaction of watching your message dry in the sun, knowing it might be read aloud in the town square, or better yet, immortalized in a temple archive for centuries. The ancient equivalent of leaving a bad review and watching it get 1,000 likes. As you linger, you overhear a teenage apprentice asking his scribe master, "What's the proper wedge for utterly disgraceful copper?" The old man answers without blinking, "The same one we use for unworthy sheep." Yes, there's literally a shared vocabulary of disappointment. You spot a small stack of finished tablets laid carefully in a woven basket. Their surfaces glisten slightly, still drying. One looks especially dense with symbols, as if someone had a lot to get off their chest. You wonder if it's Nanny's. It might be. You lean in and squint. Among the many marks, one phrase catches your eye. Transliterated by scholars millennia later, it translates to, "You treated me with contempt in front of my messenger." Oh yeah, someone was mad. That's formal burn level 3. These tablets weren't just emotionless logs, they had style, flourish, rhetoric. You could practically hear the exasperation carved into each wedge. A good scribe knew how to shade the tone. There's even some evidence that different scribes had distinct voices, much like modern writers or podcasters. One scholar refers to them as Mesopotamian stylists. Imagine, a guy sits down, lights a small oil lamp, cracks his knuckles and thinks, "How passive-aggressive can I make this line about broken copper?" Of course, not all complaints were equal. Nobles had their own scribes. Merchants had access to temple scribes for a fee. Poor folks? They mostly had to yell their frustrations at goats. Still, for those who could afford it, cuneiform was empowerment. A clay tablet wasn't just a complaint. It was a statement, a record, a warning shot. And because clay is surprisingly durable, especially when accidentally baked in city fires or forgotten in temple vaults, these angry letters often outlasted the very people they targeted. Some have even outlived entire civilizations. You watch as a scribe signs the end of his tablet with a delicate stamp, a cylinder seal rolled across the soft clay, leaving a personalized emblem. It's the Mesopotamian version of hitting send. Satisfying. Especially if you're Nanny and your copper was garbage. You're crouched now beside that basket of clay tablets, eyes scanning for anything that looks particularly aggressive in wedge form. And there it is. Nestled between a short shipping invoice and what appears to be a list of goat ailments, is the clay tablet historians know as the first recorded customer complaint. It's compact, rectangular, about the size of your hand, though definitely heavier. The surface is packed, absolutely jammed with cuneiform script, not a single inch of wasted clay. Someone really needed to vent. And that someone was Nanny, the Mesopotamian merchant who, roughly 3,750 years ago, found himself at the wrong end of a shoddy copper deal and decided enough was enough. You carefully imagine the tablet in its original moment. Soft, freshly shaped clay, sitting on a wooden desk. A scribe leans over, stylus poised. Nanny paces nearby, gesticulating wildly, his robes swishing with frustration. "Write this exactly," he says. "Every word." The result? A masterpiece of polite fury. "Tell Nasser," the tablet begins, "that Nani sends the following message." So far, so formal. But what follows is basically a multi-paragraph tirade disguised as diplomatic business prose. Nani accuses Nasser of sending him poor-quality copper, failing to deliver it promptly, mistreating his servant, and, this one stings, behaving with contempt. Oof. Here's one translation highlight. "What do you take me for, that you treat somebody like me with such contempt?" That's the ancient Sumerian version of "Do you know who I am?" but with 100% more sand and slightly less Instagram. And here's another gem. When you came, you said to me as follows, I will give fine quality copper ingots. You left then, but you did not do what you promised. It's practically a courtroom drama, but it wasn't just about the copper. It was the principle, the audacity, the broken promise, the humiliation of having a servant laughed at, maybe even refused entry by a fellow merchant. That sting, it etched itself into clay. You can almost hear the scribe's internal monologue as he worked. Wow, Nanny's really letting him have it. Should I charge double for this much text? Historians still argue whether this tablet was ever actually delivered. Did Nasser receive it, read it, toss it into a fire while muttering unkind things about Nanny's beard? We may never know. What we do know is that the tablet somehow ended up buried, preserved, and eventually recovered in Nasser's own house, specifically in what appeared to be his business archive. That's right. The very person it was complaining about had it stored on his own shelf, which raises a question. Did Nasser keep the complaint? Did he read it and shrug, tossing it onto the pile of minor grievances I will not respond to? Or was it accidentally left behind when his house was abandoned? Some scholars think this wasn't Nanny's first complaint. There may have been others. Maybe a whole saga of passive-aggressive clay correspondence. Dear Nasser, still waiting on that refund. Warm regards. And just imagine the logistics of that complaint even reaching Nasser. It would have been carried by hand, across miles of harsh terrain, potentially through bandit territory, rainstorms, and goat-related detours, only to be dumped unceremoniously at his warehouse door. If you're picturing a dusty delivery boy holding out a tablet and mumbling, it's from Nanny, before sprinting away, you're not alone. This very real tablet now rests in the British Museum behind glass. It's small, cracked, unevenly shaped, and it's gained unexpected fame as the world's first documented customer complaint. People who see it often chuckle. And fair enough. It's easy to laugh at an ancient guy fuming over copper ingots. But there's something touching about it, too. Because this clay tablet is proof of continuity, of human pettiness, yes, but also of the fundamental desire to be heard. Nanny didn't just want better copper. He wanted justice, respect, closure. And you? You're standing in Nasir's house now, or what's left of it. The walls are low, the roof long gone, the floor covered in bits of broken pottery and reed fragments. Somewhere in this very space, that complaint tablet sat for centuries. Maybe it was buried under a pile of receipts. Maybe it was used as a doorstop. Maybe Nasir read it, rolled his eyes, and said, "Not this guy again." Whatever happened, the complaint endured. It outlasted the copper, outlasted Nani, outlasted Nasir and his warehouse full of questionable merchandise. Now, it rests in a museum case. Tourists pass by, squint, read the placard, and smile. Some even take selfies with it. Historians write papers, bloggers make memes, and somewhere Nani is probably muttering, "Finally." So, copper. It doesn't sound very glamorous now, does it? Kind of dull, kind of brown, kind of, well, metal. But back in the days when pyramids were the new hot trend, and donkeys were still the main delivery system, copper was everything. It was the lifeblood of ancient Mesopotamian trade, valuable, versatile, and, as you've seen, deeply complaint-worthy. You're standing near a trade outpost now, where caravans stop to offload their goods, rest their animals, and argue loudly about prices. The copper arrives packed in large bundles, tied with reeds, sometimes covered with cloth to hide its less than sparkly appearance. And as it thuds to the ground beside you, You understand why Nani was upset. Because not all copper was created equal. Some of it gleams like a morning sunrise. Other chunks look suspiciously like river stones someone dipped in brine. There are dents. There's corrosion. There's one piece that may or may not be just a rock painted red. It's all wildly inconsistent, and quality mattered. Copper was used for everything: tools, weapons, cookware, jewelry, religious offerings. A bad batch didn't just annoy people, it could ruin them. Your entire trade reputation might hang on a shipment of metal that someone halfway across the desert decided to cheap out on. And speaking of the desert, getting copper from its source to its buyer wasn't a quick trip down the Mesopotamian expressway. No, sir. Most of it came from distant lands, places like Oman, known back then as Magan, where copper was mined and prepared for long, treacherous journeys north. Caravans loaded up, trudging across blistering sand, through scorching wind, over terrain that looked like the moon, but somehow hotter. Every day risked disaster: sudden storms, thieves, stampeding goats with poor navigational instincts. And the donkeys? Oh, they had opinions. They groaned. They stopped. They sat down in the middle of nowhere and refused to get back up, forcing entire caravans to wait while someone whispered motivational affirmations into their furry ears. And sometimes, tragically, the copper fell, got scraped, got damaged, or worse, was stolen and replaced with scrap by an enterprising thief who just really wanted a new water jug. So imagine Nani's frustration. He pays a hefty sum for quality copper. It takes weeks to arrive, and when it does, it's chipped, crusted, and barely usable. Oh, and his messenger got yelled at too. Fantastic. Historians still argue whether Nasser ever even saw the copper before it was sent. Was he in charge of quality control? Was someone else packing his goods? Did he genuinely not care? Or was it just a logistical nightmare that spiraled out of control? Some think Nasser was a kind of middleman, receiving shipments from miners, repackaging, and distributing. If so, the inconsistency may not have been entirely his fault. But judging from the tone of Nani's letter, this wasn't the first time Nasser had under-delivered. And you have to admit, there's something kind of epic about a 3,700-year-old shipping complaint. The drama, the specificity, the sheer relatability. You see a trader nearby inspecting a fresh shipment. He squints, runs his fingers over the metal, sniffs it, taps it against his palm. "Smells like river," he mutters. "Could be good." And just like that, the deal is sealed. Not with signatures, not with fancy packaging, but with trust and a little guesswork. Trade in Mesopotamia wasn't centralized. It relied on relationships, word of mouth, temple connections, and carefully cultivated reputations. That's why Nani's complaint was such a big deal. It wasn't just about bad metal. It was a public blow to Nasser's status. People in this era didn't have better Business Bureau reviews or Facebook ratings. But word traveled. Fast. Especially when carried by an official clay tablet stamped with a seal and laced with very formal disappointment. And yet, the system mostly worked. You follow a caravan for a bit, stepping carefully over the wheel ruts carved deep into the dirt road. Merchants shout to one another in multiple dialects. Goods are bartered, songs sung, agreements made. A man nearby offers a small child in trade for a goat, and the child responds with a suspiciously practiced negotiation tactic that suggests this isn't his first time. Everything hums with life. And yet underneath it all, This fragile web of trade, promises, and unpredictable copper runs the constant risk of collapse. One bad deal could sour relations between cities. One lost caravan could bankrupt a temple. One angry nanny could write a complaint so scathing it echoes for millennia. That's the tightrope Mesopotamian traders walked. And still, they kept going. Through sandstorms, sore donkeys, and occasionally questionable copper, they believed in the system. Because without it, no tools, no bronze, no temples, no ziggurats, no shiny new sickles for harvest season, just mud, reeds, and a lot of very unhappy people in linen robes. So, we've heard from Nanny. We've smelled the copper. We've met the donkeys, suffered the dust, and traced the trade routes. Now it's time to meet the man of the hour. The legend. The small business owner whose reputation, fair or not, has been dragged across 4 millennia of clay and snark. Ian Nasser. Even his name sounds like he might overcharge you for shipping. You step into the remains of his house, or rather, the ruins archaeologists believe were once his home and workshop. It's quiet. Sunlight slants through what used to be a roof, now open to the sky. Stone outlines trace out rooms that were probably full of copper ingots, scribes, apprentices, and perhaps an overworked donkey named Tulu. Here's what we know. Ian Nasser was a merchant based in Ur, dealing in metals, primarily copper, though possibly other goods too. His house was excavated in the 1950s, and within it, a small archive of clay tablets, many of which are letters from other merchants. Some are polite, some are less polite, and a surprising number are variations on the theme. Ian Nasser, your copper stinks, and I'm very upset. Now, to be fair, Ian Nasser wasn't the only merchant with complaints filed against him. This wasn't exactly a Yelp-exclusive 1-star rating situation. Trade was risky, delays were normal, and misunderstandings were frequent. But the fact that so many of the surviving letters to him are negative has made him an unexpected anti-hero of the ancient world. Was he truly shady or just unlucky? Historians still argue whether Ian Nasser was incompetent, overburdened, or simply the victim of some very well-preserved bad press. After all, what if Nani just had really high standards? What if the copper was fine, but not perfect Instagram lighting fine? Also, let's consider logistics. Running a copper business in 1750 BCE wasn't exactly a walk through the reed garden. He had to coordinate shipments from distant mines, manage laborers, negotiate at markets, and fend off anyone trying to rob him with a bronze dagger that he probably sold them last week. And Ian Nasser must have been somewhat successful. His home was substantial, with separate storage areas and writing rooms. He had scribes on staff, or at least on call, and his dealings reached across cities, even as far as Dilmun, modern Bahrain. That's a decent range for someone who apparently had trouble with quality control. Still, the nanny complaint doesn't paint him in a flattering light. You walk over to a low stone wall and imagine it as a desk, with Ian Nasser behind it. He's mid-40s, wiry, maybe balding a little at the temples. He's got that frazzled, I've been up since sunrise trying to sort a shipment energy. One of his assistants runs in. "Sir, there's another message from Nanny." Ian Nasser sighs, deeply, then mutters, "Tell him I'm out of town, indefinitely." But he doesn't smash the tablet. He keeps it. That's the fascinating part. He archives the complaint, preserves it, alongside trade receipts, shipping manifests, and delivery instructions, which suggests, maybe, he took it seriously, or at least needed to have a record on hand in case Nani escalated things to a temple official or city judge. Yes, Mesopotamia had judges. And laws. Lots of laws. Hammurabi's code, written just a few decades before this complaint, laid out everything from property rights to trade ethics. And while we don't have a legal case involving Nani and Nasser, it's entirely possible that complaints like this could have ended up in court, particularly if gods or goats were invoked. In fact, keeping a tablet on file might have been Nasser's way of covering his ancient behind. And then there's the human side. Maybe Nasser was simply overwhelmed. Maybe shipments were delayed because of illness, flooding, or donkey union strikes. Maybe he was doing his best and still letting people down. Sound familiar? You begin to feel a tiny bit sorry for him. After all, he didn't ask to be the punchline of millennia. He was just a guy trying to move some copper, make a living, and not get cursed in a letter that would end up under museum lighting. As you walk through the rubble, you spot a shard of clay, half buried in the dirt. The wedge marks are faint, but unmistakable. You wonder if it's a fragment of a forgotten message, maybe even Nasser's response. We'll never know for sure, but you can't help imagining it. Dear Nanny, your tone is noted. I did my best. Please stop sending your messenger. He smells like onions. Respectfully, Nasser. History may not have been kind to him, but in a way, he lives on more vividly than most. Not as a king or a conqueror, but as a flawed, exhausted middleman whose inbox overflowed with clay complaints, and who, by some twist of preservation, became famous for it. So here you are, still sweating gently under the Mesopotamian sun, ducking into the shade of a reed awning that smells faintly of damp goat and old ink. You're clutching a notional clay tablet now, not as a weapon, not as decor, but as a surprisingly effective tool of commerce. Welcome to the inner workings of a world where everything important is pressed into wet mud. Because when you remove the Wi-Fi and the customer service hotline and the delightful hold music, you're left with the ancient foundation of something surprisingly familiar. A transaction system. Trade. Money-ish things. Complaints. Returns. And none of it, absolutely none, would function without communication. But how do you communicate in a society with no phones, no pens, and definitely no "Hi Susan" just circling back emails? You do it all with clay and couriers. The process is simple in theory and wildly chaotic in execution. Let's walk through a trade between two parties, say Nani and Nasser. Nani decides he wants copper. He sends a servant, along with silver or another good in trade, across the desert to Nasser's warehouse. If Nasser is home and feeling generous, he provides the copper. But if he's not, or if something goes wrong, the servant returns home empty-handed, and probably sunburnt. So Nani sits down, channels his fury into dictation, and a scribe begins pressing his message into a fresh clay slab. That slab is then dried in the sun, or baked, depending on the urgency, and handed off to another messenger for delivery. It's a chain of trust, sweat, and sandals. And if any one person misplaces, smudges, or drops that clay message in a puddle, goodbye complaint. Still, it worked, mostly. Temples kept written records, markets used clay receipts, and merchant families tracked accounts with tablets stored in neat rows on shelves or inside small clay jars. You wander into one of these temple storage rooms now, cool, dim, and filled with the unmistakable earthy smell of centuries-old bureaucracy. Hundreds of clay tablets line the shelves. Some are thick as bricks, others no bigger than a biscuit. Many are tagged with clay seals or wrapped in protective cases. Think of it like the Mesopotamian version of Dropbox, only heavier and more likely to break your foot if dropped. Historians still debate just how binding these written messages were. Some tablets acted as contracts, witnessed by gods and priests, while others seem more informal, notes, messages, even gossip, immortalized in clay, and some were meant to sting. You find one such tablet. The tone is curt. The message, "I sent the donkey, you gave me no grain." short, sharp, and deeply unimpressed. Another reads, "The barley you delivered was half chaff. My servant wept," which sounds melodramatic until you remember the importance of barley in Mesopotamian life. It was food, money, and beer fuel all in one. Getting bad barley was like receiving a paycheck in Monopoly money. It's important to remember, too, that these tablets didn't float in isolation. They were part of networks, trade routes, scribe schools, temple bureaucracies, all humming with activity. A single complaint could echo across cities, passed from hand to hand like a juicy bit of gossip, and sometimes, when a tablet was too sensitive to be trusted to a stranger, it was delivered by a messenger you knew personally, a servant, a family member, someone whose honor was tied to your words. That's why Nani was extra salty about his messenger being insulted. It wasn't just bad manners. It was a slap to his social standing. You sit on a stone ledge now, watching a scribe demonstrate the writing process. He wets the clay, rolls it into a neat rectangle, then starts tapping the stylus. One wedge here, one wedge there. Slowly, a language emerges. There's a rhythm to it. Meditative. Tapping in frustration, tapping in hope. Tapping because someone gave you the wrong copper again and you will be heard. And then, once it's done, the tablet is dried or baked, sealed if necessary, sometimes even double-wrapped. One tablet sealed inside another like an ancient Mesopotamian nesting doll. Why? Because if someone tampered with the outer case, the recipient would know. It's tradecraft, literal craft. You begin to see why clay tablets were so trusted. They were hard to alter once dried. They left a permanent trail. They were tangible, weighty. There was something satisfying about them, like writing a really angry letter in cursive with a fountain pen, then carefully folding it and sealing it with wax. And you get the sense that even back then, people enjoyed the ceremony of it. Writing a complaint wasn't just venting, it was a social ritual. It said, "I am a person of substance. I record my displeasure formally, in clay." Imagine how much sassier modern reviews would be if we all had to mold and bake them. And yet, despite the hassle, the mess, the fragility, the system worked well enough for thousands of years. These people built entire economies out of dried mud and trust, all without a single call center. You're sitting now on the worn stone steps outside the temple archive, watching as a group of scribes carry trays of dried tablets into a shaded courtyard. There's a quiet ceremony to it. Careful footsteps, 2 hands on each tray, hushed voices. You'd think they were carrying sacred relics. And in a way they are. Because in ancient Mesopotamia, a clay tablet wasn't just a way to communicate, it was a legal safeguard, a storage unit, a historical record, and occasionally a passive-aggressive burn that would last longer than the pyramids. It was the cloud, 1750 BCE edition. The temples acted like central data servers. Every transaction, every contract, every complaint got logged, stored, and protected under the watchful eyes of scribes and deities alike. Imagine a filing cabinet guarded by a high priest, a very alert goat, and the occasional curse from the god Enlil just to keep things secure. Inside these temple archives, clay tablets were arranged on shelves made of wood or stacked in clay jars. Some were cataloged by type. Contracts here, taxes there, complaints in the drama section. If you wanted to verify a deal or prove someone still owed you 3 goats from last season, this was the place to go. And that brings us back to Ea-Nasir, because it turns out he was no stranger to these filing systems. Several of the tablets found in his house include not just complaints, but also business receipts and correspondence with other merchants. One tablet shows he sent copper to Dilmun. Another suggests he accepted silver in exchange. He wasn't a one-off scammer. He was part of a networked economy, and his cloud storage was full of customer interactions, good and bad. You wander back into a storage room. It's cooler here, and the walls are thick, blocking the worst of the sun. A few scribes sit cross-legged on woven mats, sorting tablets and reading aloud to one another in tones that fall somewhere between bored and mildly amused. One tablet reads, "The seal was broken before it reached me. I was not informed. The goods were light." Another, "I demanded a promise before the gods. He swore and still delivered sheep with 2 legs." The tone varies. Some complaints are icy and formal, others practically poetic in their indignation. And the responses? If they exist at all, they tend to be short, clipped, and often deflect responsibility. Classic. Now, historians still argue whether these archives were used proactively, like looking up someone's past complaints before doing business, or merely served as backups in case of dispute. There's little evidence of formal lawsuits over every trade gone wrong, but the presence of these tablets in temple stores suggests they were more than just journal entries. They were evidence, and not just for humans. Many contracts invoked divine witnesses. You didn't just swear a deal in front of your buddy. No, you called on the gods of trade, sky, and grain to watch you sign it. This wasn't just bookkeeping. It was cosmically enforced commerce. Imagine if your next PayPal transaction included a checkbox saying, "By agreeing, you invoke the wrath of Enki should you default." And these gods were picky. If a contract was broken and the gods were offended, it wasn't just social shame you risked. It was floods, locusts, maybe even your entire herd of sheep deciding to take up competitive cliff diving. Nobody wanted that. So yes, temples archived complaints like nannies not just to serve human interests, but to show the gods, "Look, we're keeping track. Justice is written here in baked clay." Now, the fragility of these tablets might seem like a flaw, but oddly enough, clay is absurdly durable when accidentally fired. Many tablets have survived floods, invasions, and centuries underground precisely because they were unintentionally baked in fires that destroyed the buildings around them. You picture Nanny's tablet. Maybe it was drying in Eonasser's house when something caught fire. A torch left too close to a reed wall, perhaps. The heat fired the clay, locking his grievance into immortality. You also wonder how many other complaints never made it that far. Broken in transit, smeared before drying, washed away by rain or stomped by a moody camel. And yet, this one did. It lived. And now it lives in a glass case in London, guarded not by a priest but by motion detectors and a tour guide named Alan. Back in the temple, a scribe hands off a sealed tablet to a courier. The courier slips it into a sling bag and walks off toward the city gates, heading for another merchant, another deal, another possible disappointment. You watch him go, and for a moment, it's easy to forget how much work goes into this kind of system. There's no electricity, no digital backup, just clay, muscle, memory, and an unshakable belief in the power of writing things down. And of course, the faint hope that this time the copper will be decent. You've settled near a sun-warmed wall now, trying to stay half in shade, half in eavesdropping distance of a scribe who's muttering something about barley bribes and a waxy shipment of dates. His tone is dry, like he's read far too many complaint tablets today, and none of them involved anything juicy. But then you hear it. "He tried to pay me off with 3 jars of spoiled beer." Your ears perk up, because this, dear listener, is where it gets messy. Let's talk about Mesopotamian reviews, the ancient equivalent of Yelp. But if everyone was mildly terrified of angering a storm god, and yes, bribery was a thing. Say you're a merchant who received subpar copper and you want to file a complaint. You visit the local scribe. But the scribe, tired, underpaid, and possibly several jugs of beer deep, might need a little incentive to make your complaint tablet really sing. And by incentive, we mean food, or barley, or maybe a promise that your cousin will help fix the scribe's leaking roof next spring. In a world without likes, stars, or retweets, your tone mattered. The words pressed into clay could make or break a merchant's standing. And some scribes had a certain flair. Their complaints could read like stern temple hymns or biting satire, depending on how well they were fed. So yes, complaints could be embellished. You walk through the market now, and it's easy to see how this culture of influence bloomed. Everyone's haggling. A potter insists his cracked vase is decoratively intentional. A fish seller waves a dead carp in the air, insisting it's still good, just aged. Meanwhile, a spice trader loudly offers free samples of what she calls sweet herb, though it smells suspiciously like dried grass. And floating among this chaos are the scribes, leaning in, listening, storing stories for later. If one of these sellers ends up on the wrong side of a deal, you can bet there'll be a tablet about it tomorrow. Or at least, there might be. If the scribe doesn't mysteriously lose interest due to an insufficient bribe. This whole system is delightfully gray. Not quite corruption, not quite fairness. Just a murky, ancient middle ground where reputation was everything and influence was currency. Some historians believe scribes operated almost like PR firms. If you had the right connections or the best dates in the market, they might describe your mistake as an unfortunate logistical delay rather than a complete betrayal of merchant trust. Others argue the system was more rigid, especially when overseen by temples or judges. In those cases, tablets were official records, and any bias could land the scribe in divine trouble. But even then, who's checking every wedge? You walk past a scribal school now. The students sit in rows on stone benches, each hunched over a chunk of clay. They practice the same sentence again and again. I received 3 talents of copper. I am content. Over and over, like some strange mantra of ancient satisfaction. But once they graduate, they're free to write whatever their patron dictates. It's here that you overhear another gem from a senior scribe. If they give you dates, make the copper adequate. If they give you fish, make it very fine. If they give you nothing, the copper was brittle and smelled of mildew. It's both hilarious and deeply human. There's also evidence that some complaints weren't even meant to reach their target. They were written, read aloud at market gatherings, and then filed. Public shaming tablets. The Mesopotamian version of subtweeting, with slightly more clay. One famous case involved a merchant whose complaint against a brewer included the phrase, "Her beer flows like the river but tastes like brine." Brutal, effective, and yes, the brewery closed 2 seasons later. So while temples were the main hubs for record-keeping, the market was the gossip engine. News traveled fast, especially when it was juicy. People whispered about Nanny's letter to Nasser for weeks, debating whether the copper was truly that bad or if Nani had just been in a mood. Some said Nasser had been cursed by a river spirit. Others claimed he simply had too many customers and stopped caring. The truth? Buried somewhere between fact and folklore. And that's what makes Mesopotamian complaints so charming. They're not cold. They're not bureaucratic. They're vivid, personal, often a little dramatic, always a little funny. Because let's face it, if you're paying someone in silver and hauling their copper across the desert, you're going to want a little flair when things go wrong. So the next time someone complains about your tone in an email, just smile and remember, At least you didn't accuse them of ruining your reputation before the gods and your messenger. And at least you didn't have to bribe someone with half a goat just to make your complaint sound appropriately disappointed. By now, you've come to understand that Mesopotamians took their copper and their complaints very seriously. But there was another layer to the whole system, one that was less about dried mud and styluses, and more about yelling at deities. Welcome to the world of customer rage rituals. Yes, that's right. Sometimes, when the copper was bad and the complaint tablet wasn't enough, you didn't just send a message. You performed a ceremonial meltdown, and you're about to witness one. It starts innocently. You follow a man, his robe slightly askew, tablet clutched tight, down a winding alley between mud brick homes. He mutters to himself, kicking up dust, clearly rehearsing his lines. He's headed not to the scribe's booth, but to the river. When he arrives, he stands at the edge of the water, arms raised dramatically. The river laps against the bank. Frogs croak. Somewhere in the reeds, a heron eyes him suspiciously. And then he begins. O mighty Enki, lord of the deep waters and wise commerce, hear me. My ingots were spongy. Yes, he's shouting at the god of wisdom and water, demanding justice for what was clearly an extremely disappointing shipment. This wasn't uncommon. Many complaints were paired with ritual appeals to the gods, formal, shouted, and occasionally theatrical enough to draw a small crowd. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies were symbolic gestures, actual legal proceedings, or just highly committed venting. Either way, they happened, and they were intense. You settle on a rock and observe. The ritual involves the complaint being read aloud, sometimes repeatedly, before casting the offending tablet into the river or burying it near a shrine. Sometimes people burned bits of barley or poured beer into the water as an offering. The thinking seemed to be, if the gods heard my frustration, surely they'll act on it. And just like that, your bad copper shipment becomes divine business. Of course, not everyone had time to shout at Enki. There were less dramatic options for handling disappointment. One of the more curious included crafting a clay figurine of the offending merchant, say, Ia Nasir, and then whispering your complaints to it, before either smashing it or tucking it into a shrine. Call it proto-voodoo, call it stress relief. Either way, the symbolism was strong. You didn't just feel wronged, you wanted the cosmic scales rebalanced. Even more peculiar were the rituals involving rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates weren't just water sources, they were divine entities. If your business partner cheated you, one option was to swear an oath by the river. If they broke that oath, the gods of the water were expected to retaliate. In some records, people even demanded that offending merchants go to the river and swear innocence. If they refused, that was seen as an admission of guilt. Sort of like saying, nope, not putting my hand on the holy polygraph today. You wander past a small shrine nestled between market stalls now. It's covered in offerings, bundles of reeds, tiny cups of oil, even what looks like a miniature clay goat. A man kneels before it, eyes shut, whispering something that sounds suspiciously like, please let Ia Nasir trip in a puddle. These moments, half faith, half frustration, weren't just about spiritual comfort. They served a social purpose. A public complaint, whether shouted at the river or whispered to a god statue, told everyone around you that your trust had been violated. You weren't just protecting your pride, you were warning the community. Imagine how different modern customer service would be if, instead of a one-star review, people had to stage a small ritual at their local lake. You call your friends, wear your nicest linen tunic, and read aloud a carefully worded complaint to the sky before dropping your cracked phone into a decorative pond. Admittedly less convenient than a tweet, but so much more theatrical. And yes, there were temples and judges you could take your complaint to as well, especially if goods had been promised in a sacred oath. But if you couldn't afford that, you had the gods, or at least the illusion that they were listening. Sometimes that was all you needed, and sometimes you just needed to feel heard, even if the only audience was a frog and a priest half listening from the shade. As you leave the riverside, you pass another man holding a complaint tablet. He's not shouting, not offering barley. He's just sitting on a rock staring at it. Maybe he's deciding whether to file it. Maybe he's waiting for the wind to change. Or maybe, just maybe, he's thinking what we've all thought at least once. Was it really worth the copper? You follow the riverbank for a while, past tiny garden plots and sun-bleached fish traps, until you reach the edge of the copper district, an area that smells unmistakably like hot metal, dust, and mild disappointment. This is where the copper gets stored, sorted, and, if you're unlucky, shoved into your hands with the promise that yes, really, it's the good kind. And right at the heart of it all, barely standing under the oppressive heat, is a modest mud brick warehouse believed to have belonged to none other than Ea Nasir himself. Congratulations. You've arrived at the most infamous storage room in Mesopotamian history. You duck inside and immediately regret it. The air is thick, stale. It smells like mildew, old sweat, and copper that's been sitting in the same spot since Hammurabi had a good hairline. It's dark, too. The only light comes from narrow slit windows high on the wall. They let in just enough light to reveal the shapes of what's stored here. Rows of crude copper ingots, baskets of reeds, cracked amphorae, and a collection of broken clay tablets that probably didn't survive delivery in one piece. And standing amid this chaos? A young assistant. Call him something appropriately overworked, like Arad Malik. He's maybe 15, barefoot, covered in copper dust, and currently balancing a tray of tablets while trying to keep a goat from licking a pile of ingots. You catch his eye. He sighs, loudly. The universal sound of an underpaid employee. This, more than anything, is what makes the Nani complaint land with such resonance. Because this isn't just an unhappy letter sent across miles. It's a direct assault on this room, this whole operation, on the smells, on the dents, on the general vibe of we tried but not that hard. Let's talk about the copper itself for a moment. In ancient Mesopotamia, copper came in rough, rectangular ingots. They weren't stamped with quality assurance marks or shrink-wrapped in temple-certified linen. No, they were lumpish, slightly misshapen, and had to be assessed by eye, touch, and experience, which meant if you were sent a bad batch, you'd know. It would be obvious. Too soft, too brittle, crumbly edges, a weird green sheen that said, "I've been left in a damp cellar next to a dead rat." And unless you were there in person to inspect the goods, you were at the mercy of the sender's honesty, or lack thereof. Which brings us back to this warehouse. Ea Nasir might have had good intentions. Maybe he wanted to be known as the region's most trustworthy copper merchant. But then, the caravan was late. The copper looked a little off. He was behind on orders. His assistant dropped 3 ingots in a puddle and pretended it didn't happen. And somewhere in all that mess, Nani's copper got packed with the wrong shipment. Historians still argue whether Ea Nasir had full control over his inventory. Was he meticulous or sloppy? Was he in the warehouse every day checking shipments and berating goats? Or was he lounging in his back room, sipping date wine and assuming everything was fine? One thing's for certain. Something went wrong in this warehouse. Enough to inspire a complaint that would last longer than most human civilizations. You wander to the far corner of the room. There's a stack of cracked tablets here, some fully intact, others chipped like badly shipped pottery. One has been partially smeared, as if someone pressed it too soon after writing. Another has what looks like a tiny sandal print in the middle. A failed message? A stepped-on invoice? A tantrum stomp? You don't know, but they all feel like echoes. Near the back wall, you find a low shelf with better preserved tablets. Most are receipts. 1 talent of copper delivered. 2 shekels paid. Ingots received. Weight acceptable. These are the everyday moments of ancient trade. Dry, factual, devoid of drama. And then there's that one tablet. It sits apart, slightly larger, slightly heavier. And the marks on it? Longer, deeper, angrier. Maybe this is the original. Maybe it's a copy. Maybe it's one of many. But as you run your fingers along the grooves, you can almost hear Nanny again, fuming as the scribe carved out his fury. The copper you sent me was not only bad, it was insulting. And maybe it was. You walk outside again, squinting in the sudden sunlight. The warehouse looms behind you, small and unimpressive. If you didn't know its history, you'd think it was just another storage room on a side street in Ur. But now you know better. This is the origin site of one of history's most enduring complaints. A place where expectation met reality, and reality was a bit crumbly around the edges. A goat bleats. Somewhere inside, Arad Malik sighs again, and you start to wonder how many other angry letters were sent out from the same warehouse. Unanswered, unarchived, lost to time and sand. Only Nanny's endured, because sometimes, when the air is thick with sweat and the copper smells weird, the only thing to do is write it all down and hope someone someday understands. You leave Nasser's warehouse behind, stepping out into the main road of Ur where the air is slightly fresher and slightly less judgmental. The sun is beginning to dip, and the shadows stretch long over the baked clay streets. Merchants are closing shop. Donkeys are giving each other that end-of-shift stare. And somewhere nearby, a messenger is about to start a very long walk, with a small slab of carefully inscribed clay tucked into his satchel. Because the story of a Mesopotamian complaint doesn't end when it's written. It has to be delivered. And that delivery, oh, it's a whole saga. In a world without stamps, mailboxes, or digital attachments, tablets were sent across vast distances the old-fashioned way. On foot, by donkey, or occasionally by riverboat if you were fancy. There were no formal postal services, not like today's infrastructure, but there were networks of trusted messengers. People whose job it was to carry tablets, gifts, and occasionally threats from one city to another without getting eaten by a lion or distracted by roadside bread vendors. You trail behind one such messenger now. He's got a weathered leather bag, a reed hat, and a determined expression that says, "I am not stopping for snacks this time." He heads northeast, out of Ur, across the open plains toward Dilmun. It's a journey that could take weeks. And he's not just carrying a letter, he's carrying intent. Proof of a transaction, evidence of insult, a tiny baked summary of someone else's rage. The tablets themselves had to be packed carefully. If they were still damp, they'd be ruined in transit. If too brittle, they might snap. So most were partially baked, just enough to hold form. Not so much that they became rock solid. To protect them, they were often wrapped in palm leaves or stored in clay cases, like envelopes, but heavier and much easier to drop on your toe. And then came the presentation. A messenger arriving in a city couldn't just walk up and fling a tablet at someone's feet. Oh no. There were protocols. The message had to be announced, sometimes at the merchant's home, sometimes at a public space like the market or city gate. If the sender was important, the messenger might even recite a short speech to accompany the delivery. You imagine Nani's servant arriving at Nasser's front door, dusty, tired, possibly sunburned and in desperate need of a nap. He presents the tablet and says, with formal gravitas, something like, "This is from Nani, who is most displeased. Also, he wants it known that your copper was an embarrassment to trade itself." Nasser presumably blinks once and mutters, "Great." Of course, things didn't always go smoothly. Messengers could be intercepted. Tablets could be lost. Occasionally, tablets were broken on purpose, either to erase the message or to prevent it from reaching its target. That's why many letters were copied. Scribes often created backup versions of important complaints, just in case someone got clever with a hammer along the way. And if you think passive aggression was invented in the 20th century, think again. Some tablets included little notes like, "I have sent this message 3 times already and still await your reply," which is basically the ancient version of "per my last email." Historians still debate how many messengers were in permanent employ and how many were hired ad hoc. Some were trusted family members. Others were professional couriers. A few were temple runners, tasked with transporting official documents between city-states. But in any case, it was a respected and occasionally dangerous job. You see one such courier now resting under a date palm, removing his sandals and rubbing his feet with a look of long-suffering nobility. You imagine him thinking, "I have carried a brick of someone's grudge across 2 rivers and a goat festival. I deserve better pay." And speaking of pay, messengers were sometimes rewarded based on speed. There are records of delivery times being included in the message. "I expect a reply within 5 days," which, considering the terrain, was optimistic at best and delusional at worst. Still, the system worked. Messages were sent, replies were received, and once in a while a complaint found its target with all the force of a verbal sandal slap. But here's the truly strange part. We don't actually know if Nasser ever replied to Nani's tablet. The response, if it existed, was lost, never written, or simply smashed in frustration. Maybe he dictated a reply and never sent it. Maybe the messenger slipped into a tavern halfway there and traded the response for flatbread. Or maybe Nasser just didn't feel like answering. You picture him shrugging, tossing the tablet into a bin of broken pottery, and muttering something about overreacting customers. Classic. Still, the very act of sending the tablet changed things. Even if the message was ignored, it was recorded, filed, remembered, and through an accident of archaeology, preserved. You walk a little farther, watching the last light slip over the horizon. Somewhere, far ahead, a messenger with sore feet and a very heavy bag presses on, hoping that this time the complaint will be heard, or at least that someone will offer him dinner when he gets there. Evening falls over and with it comes a cooler breeze, and the soft clinking of temple bells in the distance, signaling the end of trade for the day. You find yourself drawn toward a quieter corner of the city now, a narrow courtyard bathed in amber light from hanging oil lamps. It's quiet, but not deserted. A scribe sits beneath a fig tree, carefully smoothing a tablet with water and clay, preparing it for inscription. What he's working on isn't just a message, it's a contract. And if you've ever signed a lease, rented a donkey, don't lie, or agreed to anything after checking "I accept the terms and conditions," then you've participated in a system with roots as old as this. Because Mesopotamians were some of the earliest humans to truly formalize the art of putting it in writing. That copper shipment you've heard so much about? It wasn't just a handshake deal. There was usually a contract behind it, a clay tablet inscribed with the details: who was buying, who was selling, how much was being paid, when it was due, and occasionally a little something extra, like a curse clause. Yes, curses, formal ones. You lean over the scribe's shoulder and see it clearly. If the terms are broken, may Shamash strike down the liar, and may his goats never breed again. Subtle. These contracts weren't just promises between humans. They invoked the gods as witnesses. Think of it like signing a contract while swearing on your grandmother's recipe book, a stack of law books, and your favorite deity, all at once. Breaking the deal wasn't just rude, it was sacrilegious. And yet, people broke them all the time. That's why so many of these clay tablets include something else. Receipts. Little follow-up tablets confirming that the copper was received, or the barley was returned, or that the merchant didn't, in fact, follow through on his promise, and therefore deserves public shame and possibly a divine rash. You pass by a small neighborhood shrine now, where a collection of tiny stamped tablets sits in a carved recess. These aren't messages. They're votive offerings, contracts between people and the divine. A farmer promises the first part of his barley harvest to the goddess Ninhursag if she ensures good weather. A woman offers thanks for a safe childbirth and asks that her next merchant interaction involve less attitude. It's all deeply transactional, but also personal, binding, ritualistic, and just a little dramatic. Now, if a complaint like Nanny's wasn't resolved after one tablet, the next step was escalation. Often, this involved drafting a new tablet, a formal record of the unresolved grievance, maybe even read aloud at the market or temple. Think of it like leaving a second, much angrier voicemail. Some complaints even included witnesses. Let it be known before the gods, the scribes, and my cousin Dumuzi that this copper was an offense. And sometimes things got litigious. Temples and city officials served as legal arbiters, settling disputes, especially when contracts were broken. Records from cities like Lagash and show tablets detailing court decisions, penalties, and forced repayments. In particularly juicy cases, there were fines, public shame rituals, or even temporary bans from market participation. But there's an important wrinkle here. Clay could be reused. If a complaint or contract no longer mattered, or if someone decided to cover their tracks, they could soak the tablet in water, smooth it out, and start fresh. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. And historians still argue whether some of the more damning tablets were intentionally destroyed after being resolved, ignored, or inconvenient. Was Nasir's response tablet soaked and reused? Was it accidentally tossed into a fire? Did he break it in frustration after reading Nani's angry tone? We'll never know. But the one we do have, the famous complaint, is part of a larger story. A paper trail made of earth. From contract to complaint, from accusation to archive, Mesopotamians were building a world where memory could be stored, not just passed by word of mouth. You pause beside a low wall where someone has etched a few simple wedge marks. Not official writing, just practice. A child's attempt at learning the craft. Maybe this scribe in training will one day write a copper complaint of their own. Maybe they'll draft the first love poem that also doubles as a rental agreement. The system wasn't perfect. Contracts could be ignored. Receipts could be faked. Curses sometimes failed to manifest, much to the goat's relief. But even with all its flaws, this was a civilization that believed deeply in the power of clay and promise. They believed that by carving words into earth and sealing them with faith, they could shape reality. And honestly, isn't that what we're all still trying to do, just with less dust? You wake to the sound of clay clinking softly in the distance. Maybe it's morning again in Ur, or maybe the city just never fully sleeps. Either way, something's been nagging at you. A question as ancient as the cuneiform it's carved into. Did Nasir ever reply? You walk back through the now familiar alleys, past the reed-roofed markets and the slow-moving donkey carts. A few early merchants are already setting up shop, brushing last night's dust off their wares. The sky glows faintly gold, and the copper district smells a little more tolerable in the cool air. Ia Nasser's house, yes, that house, is quiet. No goat noises this time, just the creak of wood and the low murmur of a scribe counting inventory out loud. You peek in. Still no reply tablet on the table. So, what happened? Historians have puzzled over this for decades. Nanny's complaint tablet was real. It was found in Ia Nasser's home, but no record of a reply has ever surfaced. Maybe Ia Nasser wrote back and the tablet was lost. Maybe it was smashed in a fit of copper-fueled rage. Maybe his assistant dropped it down a well, or a hungry goat mistook it for a salty snack. Or maybe, just maybe, Ia Nasser didn't reply at all. Imagine that. He receives the complaint, reads it, and just shrugs, says to himself, "Not this again," and drops it onto the to-deal-with-later pile, which, judging by his warehouse, was likely an actual pile. You sit near the doorway, imagining the moment. Ia Nasser opens the clay envelope, unrolls the stylus-scratched message, and slowly reads Nanny's righteous fury. His eyes scan lines like, "You treated me with contempt," and "I will not accept this copper." His eyebrows twitch, maybe. But instead of calling for a scribe, he calls for breakfast. Because here's the thing. It's entirely possible he felt no obligation to respond. Mesopotamian trade was a complicated, often informal web of relationships. Not every complaint required a reply, especially if the merchant thought the sender wasn't influential enough to cause real trouble. Or perhaps Ia Nasser had a reputation for stonewalling. Maybe this was his thing. You picture other merchants grumbling at taverns. Did Ia Nasser answer you? No. Yeah, he never does. You gotta show up in person or threaten to call in a priest. That would explain a lot. But here's another theory, one that some scholars love. What if Ia Nasser did reply, but the message was really boring, so boring that nobody preserved it, or so diplomatically dull that it lacked the flair of Nanny's original complaint? Maybe it was just, "Dear Nanny, sorry about the copper. We'll send better next time. Regards." Compare that to the original tablet, which included phrases like, "What do you take me for?" and "You have treated me with great dishonor." It's no contest. We preserve what is interesting, dramatic, memorable. So maybe the reply got tossed because it didn't sparkle. Maybe a scribe looked at it and thought, "Meh," before reusing the clay to draft a tax record about goat dung. Of course, there's always the final possibility that Ia Nasser replied verbally, in person, that he met with Nani, explained the delay, and sorted the issue face-to-face like two dusty, sunburned grown-ups. But that seems unlikely, given Nanny's dramatic flair and the fact that he went full clay tablet nuclear. No, if a reply existed, it probably looked like one of three things. 1. A straightforward clay response, now lost or broken. 2. A verbal promise to do better, never fulfilled. 3. Absolutely nothing. And honestly, the silence is kind of poetic, because in that silence, Ia Nasser becomes something more than a merchant. He becomes an idea, the eternal ghost of every bad seller who left your messages on read, who promised express shipping and delivered broken dreams. He's the ancestor of the online store that stopped replying after taking your money. The guy who swore his used donkey only had one careful owner. The service provider who went mysteriously silent after looking into it. And because of that silence, because of the absence of his reply, Nani's voice gets louder, clearer, preserved across time. His complaint becomes a monologue, a soliloquy. the literary equivalent of shouting into the void and having it echo back 4,000 years later, louder than ever. You walk slowly past the tablet archive again, thinking about that strange balance. For every complaint sent, a response was supposed to come. But when it doesn't, when the silence wins, that's when a complaint becomes something greater. A statement, a fossil, a wink from the past. Eonisir may have said nothing, but in doing so he let Nanny speak forever. The sun hangs heavy over now, casting golden light on the mud brick buildings and glinting off the tops of reed-thatched stalls. You've walked the streets, heard the complaints, stepped through the warehouse funk, and pored over the tablets. And yet, despite everything, one mystery remains. Why did people keep complaining even when nothing changed? It's a fair question. Because if the Nani tablet is any indication, the ancient world was no stranger to poor service, bad product quality, and merchants who didn't quite live up to the brochure. And yet the tablets kept coming, over and over. Thousands of them from all across Mesopotamia, written, delivered, and, most importantly, preserved. So what gives? You find yourself seated again at a bustling market corner, watching a familiar dance unfold. A woman argues with a vendor about the weight of some onions. A shepherd insists that his sheep is worth at least 5 shekels, not 3 in a fish. A merchant defends his crumbling amphorae with a long-winded speech about vintage charm. And then someone walks away, tablet in hand. It hits you. These complaints weren't just about getting results. They were about the act of complaining itself. To file a formal grievance was to perform a social ritual, a statement of your identity, your expectations, your place in the community. You didn't just mutter under your breath and move on. You took the time to shape wet clay into words. You got a scribe. You paid them, probably in barley. You waited as they formed your frustration into legal language. You reviewed it, you signed it with a seal, and then you sent it off. The message was clear. I matter enough to say something. It's the oldest form of self-advocacy, one with weight, literally and metaphorically. And maybe, just maybe, that was the whole point. Historians still debate whether the Mesopotamian complaint process was designed for actual resolution, or mostly served to keep social order. Some suggest it worked more like an honor system, calling out bad behavior not to punish the wrongdoer, but to warn others. You see it now in action. A customer holds up a tablet near a pottery stall and reads it aloud. The vendor scowls. Shoppers nod. A few quietly step away from the stall. No judge was involved. No god struck down lightning. But the message, it landed. It was like Yelp, but with public reading and considerably more drama. You pass by a temple scribe station, where tablets are drying on wooden racks. One says, "The fish was foul, and the seller unrepentant." Another, "The wool was full of thorns, and my servant bled." And just when you think you've seen it all, a third catches your eye. "The lentils arrived late and smelled of sulfur. I suspect divine punishment." Incredible, but this ritual didn't only serve public relations. It scratched a very human itch, the need to tell the story. When someone wrongs you, it's not just the loss that stings. It's the injustice, the break in the social contract. You gave silver, they gave you disappointment. And telling others? Writing it down? It gave that experience structure, meaning, closure, even if nothing changed. Sometimes the act of complaining was the only thing people could control. And what about the scribes? They thrived in this system. They weren't just neutral typists. They were interpreters, judges, counselors, and occasionally gossip conduits. A well-worded complaint could boost their reputation. Some scribes were even known by name across multiple cities, a sign that their tablets were particularly well written or ruthlessly effective. You picture Nani again, pacing in his sandals, dictating his fury. The scribe listens, nodding, adding a little flourish here, a rhetorical jab there. Not embellishment, just tone. A style that said, yes, I'm angry, but I'm also educated, well-connected, and prepared to immortalize this moment in history. And immortalize it they did. Now, complaints also offered something else. A paper trail. Or rather, a clay one. If the dispute escalated to temple courts, you needed documentation, something concrete. He promised this, or she said that, didn't fly when trade disputes were involved. But if you had a signed, sealed tablet in your archive, boom, case closed. So even if the complaint didn't result in better copper or a heartfelt apology, it became insurance. If Ia Nasser cheated Nani again, Nani could say, see, this is a pattern. And sometimes just the threat of documentation was enough. You turn back toward the reed-roofed house of a vendor, where a new customer is placing an order. As they finalize the exchange, the buyer raises a hand and says, and don't forget, I keep my scribe nearby. The seller laughs nervously, because in Ur, no one wants to end up in a complaint tablet. That's not just a bad day, that's eternal embarrassment. So people keep writing, keep filing, keep shouting their grievances to river gods, clay tablets, and underpaid messengers, because somehow, somewhere, it makes them feel better, even if nothing changes, even if the copper is still bad, even if Ia Nasir is already halfway to Dilmun with a donkey full of excuses. The wind has softened now, slipping gently through the palm trees as the last chatter of merchants fades into evening murmurs. Ur begins to hush, and you find yourself near the edge of the ziggurat, that towering stack of mud brick ambition pointing toward the sky. You climb halfway up the steps, not for worship, but to sit and look out over the city. The rooftops, the fading embers of cook fires, the slow return of goats to their pens. It's peaceful, almost too peaceful for a place where people once hurled literary shade in clay form. And that's when it hits you. That one little tablet, just a palm-sized square of hardened earth, somehow survived everything. Floods, fires, conquest, looters, even time itself. And now? It sits behind museum glass, wearing a tiny plaque, being chuckled at by school groups and internet meme pages alike. That complaint from Nani to Ia Nasser, preserved for millennia, may be the oldest surviving human tantrum. And yet it's more than a tantrum. It's a story, a cry for fairness, a written demand to be taken seriously, at a time when fairness was negotiable at best. So what does it mean, really? Why do we care about this tablet? Because it proves that we've always been like this. We've always wanted quality in return for our labor. We've always had expectations. We've always held on to dignity with both hands, especially when it's bruised. We've always needed to say something when the deal went wrong. You hear it in Nani's words, echoed across time. This is not acceptable. This is not fair. I expected better. And what makes it strangely comforting is that he wasn't a king or a priest. He wasn't carving edicts or summoning armies. He was just a frustrated customer trying to get decent copper and not be treated like trash in front of his messenger. And here we are, 4,000 years later, nodding along, because we've all been there. We've all gotten the wrong item in the mail. We've all had that one awful vendor. We've all composed a strongly worded review in our heads while brushing our teeth. Some of us hit send. Nani hit sunbake. And he wasn't alone. There were others. Anonymous voices on crumbling tablets, complaining about fish, wool, lentils, livestock, you name it. Some were more polite, Some were pure Mesopotamian sass, but all of them shared the same basic drive: to be heard. Even Nasser in his silence says something. He tells us that trade was messy, that complaints were expected, that customer service was already complicated long before hold music was invented. Historians still argue whether Nasser was a villain, a victim, or just a guy who had a bad shipment day and made the mistake of not refunding a particularly vocal client. But one thing is clear: Nanny's voice won. Not by volume, not by clever rhetoric, but by sheer endurance. His clay survived, his frustration fossilized, his words became legend. You look out over Ur once more. The city is dim now, the fires banked, the streets quiet. Somewhere a donkey shifts in its sleep. Somewhere else, a scribe sets down his stylus for the night. And somewhere, even now, another complaint is forming. Not in clay, maybe. Not in wedges and strokes, but in words, in tone, in the deep, timeless urge to say, "This is not okay." And that's what connects us to them. Not the copper, not the goats, not even the styluses, but the stories. The act of recording life. Flawed, frustrating, and faintly ridiculous. As if it mattered. Because it does matter. That's why we tell these tales, why we archive them, why we fall asleep to them. Not just because they're boring in the best possible way, but because they remind us that being human, messy, picky, dissatisfied human, is nothing new. And as the last wind brushes past your cheek and the stars begin to shimmer above the ziggurat, you feel it. That strange, sleepy sense of comfort that comes from knowing you're part of something ancient, sarcastic, and surprisingly well documented. Let the story settle now, like clay cooling under the moonlight. The city of fades gently behind your eyes. Its noises soften to a distant hush. The smell of copper, reeds, and warm dust slips away. The voices of merchants and messengers blur into the background hum, replaced by the soft, steady rhythm of your own breath. There's no need to remember the exact weight of an ingot or the full text of Nanny's complaint. Those details can rest now, safely stored in your imagination's archive. No need to carry them tonight. Instead, hold on to the feeling, the quiet amusement, the strange nostalgia for a time you never lived, and the knowledge that people have always tried and failed and tried again to make things right. Even if the copper was bad, even if the messenger got roasted, even if the reply never came. It's all part of the same old story. A slow, sleepy story, passed hand to hand across centuries. A story made of dust and nerve and words that simply refuse to disappear. So breathe in once more and let that last image drift across your mind. A small clay tablet tucked into a corner of a dim room, quietly waiting to be remembered. You can leave it there now. The scribes are gone, the merchants have slept, and the complaint? It's been heard.